Welcome to this week's video of Tuesdays with Thomas. This week we're going to talk about the fourth way. So I have to tell you that of the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas, this one was definitely the one that was the most challenging for me. And I wanted to just tell you about a couple of resources that I've relied upon a lot, but especially found very helpful for this particular study. First of all, there is this book on Aquinas by Edward Feser, which I have found tremendously helpful and would encourage you to check out, and especially his section on the fourth way. And then also there is this more massive volume by John Whipple on the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, in which he discusses the fourth way. Feser is a little bit more sympathetic, I think, overall to what Aquinas is arguing in the fourth way. Whipple certainly is as well, but I think Feser especially so. And I'll do my very best to represent what I think Aquinas's point was. Always bear in mind, as a novice student of Thomas Aquinas, that when I fail to understand him, and sometimes his arguments don't make sense, I just remember that he was a genius and I'm not. And particularly because he's coming from a certain philosophical undergirding that I don't have, and from a framework that we in the modern world don't generally think with. It's important to try to understand the terminology and background behind these arguments. So let me begin by summarizing what we've seen so far. In the first way, Aquinas argued that by looking at the change we see around us, and from the series of changes we see around us, there must be ultimately an unchanging changer who makes those changes possible. Secondly, he argued in the second way that when we look and see the series of efficient causes in our world, that points us back to an uncaused cause that stands at the head or first in rank in that series of causes. And then in the third way, which we studied in the previous video, when we look at the things that are possible to be and not be, or we might call them contingent things, that there must ultimately be something that is necessary, a necessary being. Well, the fourth way has to do with the being that is the ultimate or supreme being, on the basis of beings that we see around us that fall at various levels of perfection, grades or gradation of perfection. So let's take a look at some background that'll help us understand a little bit more about the conclusion that Aquinas drives at. Here's where eventually his argument is going to head. He says at the end of the fourth way, therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. How is he going to get to that point? Well, before we look at the text of the fourth way, I want to step back for just a second and look at one of the key concepts that is foundational to Thomas's view of the structure of the world. Based on the philosophy of Aristotle, Aquinas would say we look around us and we see a ladder or chain of beings. We see sort of at the bottom of it rocks, minerals. Those are non-living beings. They can't really do a whole lot. They just kind of rest there. And then above them we see plants, trees, and grass. And these are beings that have matter and form composed together, but in addition to that, they actually can do things. They, for example, can reproduce. They can draw nutrients out of the ground. But then, at an even higher level of being, we see animals, cats and fish. And they have matter and form together like rocks, and they also can reproduce and draw nourishment like plants. But then additionally, animals also can sense things, they see things, and they can move. And then even higher than that, we have human beings, which are composed of matter and form together, and can also reproduce and draw nourishment, and also can sense things and move around like animals. But then even above all of those other things, human beings have rational powers. They can think about thinking. They can think abstract thoughts. And so this level of beings, Aristotle pointed out, is a hierarchy of being that as you go up each step or each rung of the ladder, you find increasing capabilities to do things. Or in the jargon of Aristotle, greater levels of actuality, that is, the power to actualize potentials. Rocks don't possess that much power to actualize things. They just kind of lay there. Plants, they can actualize some potentials to nourish and reproduce. Animals can actualize even more potentials to sense things and to move. Human beings can actualize even more. And based on the first way, you can anticipate that Aquinas would say, and Aristotle would say, that even higher than human beings would, of course, be God, because he is pure actuality. So as you go in greater and greater levels of actuality, higher and higher on this ladder of being, that which is pure actuality would be the highest of all. And that's what the first way argues for and points toward. So this is sometimes called the hierarchy of being, the ladder of being, the chain of being. You get the idea. Now then, we've used this word being here to describe all of the different categories of things you see pictured here: the rocks, the plants, the animals, the humans. Well, since the word being can refer to all rungs of the ladder, all the categories, so to speak, the word being transcends all of the categories. And since the word being transcends all of the categories, it comes to be known in philosophical jargon as a transcendental. Now, this is not to be confused with anything like, transcendental meditation. It just means that the word being transcends the category of rock, plant, animal, or human to refer to all of the things that you see listed here. By the way, the word thing would also be a transcendental. A human is a thing, an animal is a thing, a plant is a thing, a rock is a thing. Which leads us to another important point. Any term that is a transcendental, like the word being and the word thing, is convertible, which means the one can be used in the place of the other. Now, it's obvious with words like being and thing and something, almost so obvious that it's painful to even acknowledge it. A being is a thing is a something. Yeah, of course. Some of the transcendentals, though, may not seem as obvious to us at first. For example, the word true is a transcendental, which may not seem like as obvious a point because we think of things as true or false, not as being or non-being. But the way the word true is being used as a transcendental in this sense is something that is real or genuine. Like, for example, if you've read a novel and then a movie is made of the novel and someone goes to see it and then you ask them, was the movie true to the novel? There is a thing, the novel. It has being. And you want to know, to what extent was the movie an accurate portrayal or representation of that thing, of the book? Well, that's the idea of the word true here. We're not talking about true or false, like whether 2 plus 2 is 4 or 5. We're talking about something being real or genuine. The word good is also a transcendental. And again, we think of the word good often in a moral context. Is somebody a good or bad person in the sense of ethically good or bad? But the idea here is more in terms of something as a good example. Like if I ask you, what is a good example of a flower? You might say a rose is a good example of a flower. Or if I ask you, what is a good example of a comedy? You might say Dumb and Dumber is a good example of a comedy. What we're talking about are things which are good exemplifiers of something. So that's the idea here of good. And that's why being, thing, true, and good can be transcendentals. They're convertible in this sense. We already in our minds, in our pop culture even, have a way to understand how words that on the surface seem so different can be convertible or interchangeable in a certain sense. Here's Superman / Clark Kent, two very different names, and yet they refer to the same person just from a different point of view. Superman when he is in his regalia as a superhero, Clark Kent when he is the mild-mannered alter ego. Well, transcendentals are just like Superman, Clark Kent. Two different terms, that apply to the same person viewed from a different perspective. Transcendentals are convertible because they designate one and the same thing from a different point of view. How good an example is something. How true to the ideal is something. That's why good and true and being can be interchangeable in this philosophical sense. So for this reason, then, we can use the word good to describe a sapphire, a tomato, a cat, and a man. A good sapphire would be a sapphire that best exemplifies the qualities of the ideal sapphire. A good tomato is red and ripe and juicy and delicious. A good cat is a cat with 4 legs and beautiful fur and all of the other qualities that we think of as the ideal cat. A good man is someone who uses his rational faculties to their proper end. So we're using the word good to talk about 4 very different categories of beings, and yet we know exactly what we mean when we use the word good in each sense. We're talking about something that conforms to the ideal, and it is good or bad to the degree it conforms to the ideal. Now, as soon as we start talking about an ideal, though, that starts to point us in the direction of what the 4th way is all about. That there must be some ideal standard of goodness. And since goodness and being are convertible, if there is an ideal good, there is an ideal or supreme being. So now let's take a look at the actual text of the 4th way. It begins like this. The 4th way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings, there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. And as soon as you see Thomas say good, true, and noble, you know he's talking about transcendentals. Richard Dawkins, the atheist, misses this badly when he responds to the 4th way by saying, that's an argument. You might as well say people vary in smelliness, but we can make the comparison only in reference to a perfect maximum of conceivable smelliness. A peerless stinker we call God. Well, smelliness is not a transcendental. It's not a term that would apply to all categories. Back to more serious philosophy now. Aquinas continues, more and less are predicated of different things according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter according as it is more nearly resembles that which is hottest. In other words, he can talk about something more or less with all of these different categories as they represent the ideal, just like we could talk about a good sapphire, tomato, cat, or man. So that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is uttermost being. Why can he shift from true, best, and noblest to being? Because these are convertible transcendentals. And then he refers to the metaphysics of Aristotle. Continuing, he says, now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus. As fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. In other words, in any category, that which is the cause of all things in the category must be the maximum. This is really what he's already argued. He's already argued in the 1st way that there are potentials made actual, so there must be something which is the maximum actuality, pure actuality. He's argued in the 2nd way that there are efficient causes, so there must be the maximum or first preeminent cause. So here what he's simply arguing is there are levels of being, so there must therefore be that which is the uttermost being. Later in the Summa, Thomas talks more about why it is that everything in a genus or category derives from a maximum when he says this. Therefore, all beings apart from God are not their own being, but are beings by participation. Therefore, it must be that all things which are diversified by the diverse participation of being, so as to be more or less perfect, are caused by one first being who possesses being most perfectly. In other words, if you look at this hierarchy of beings, all of them participate in being. They don't have being inherently. They must derive it. And they must derive it from something whose essence just simply is existence, as we talked about in the previous video, whose essence just is being. And that being is goodness, truth, etc. And therefore, he says, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. Or in other words, what the 4th way says is there must be that which is the supreme being.